The snow started on a Tuesday. By Thursday morning, the valley had disappeared. 9 feet of it, packed hard against every door, every window, every wall that had been built the way walls were supposed to be built. Families who had laughed at their neighbor just 3 months earlier were now burning furniture to stay warm. 2 households abandoned their cabins entirely, trudging through the drifts to find shelter elsewhere. But one home held, not a proper cabin, not a frame house with a stone chimney and a cedar roof. Something the community had called reckless. Something a few of the older men had openly mocked. A hole in a hillside, they said, fit for animals, not for a man raising a child. The fire inside the hillside had not been touched since the previous night. No one had gotten up at 3 a.m. to add wood. No one had fought the wind at the door. No one had checked the draft. No one had wrapped themselves in every blanket they owned just to survive until dawn. The boy slept through the entire storm. His father sat near the entrance, watching the snow pile against the world outside, and felt something close to quiet satisfaction, the kind that doesn't need to say anything because the temperature inside already said it all. What that man understood about heat, stone, and earth, things no one around him had bothered to ask about before the storm, is what this video is going to show you. Because the secret wasn't in the fire. It wasn't even in the wood. It was in something most people walk right past without ever noticing. If you've ever wondered whether the old ways actually worked, or if you just appreciate a story where the underdog turns out to be right, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We've got people watching from Montana to Norway, and we want to know where you're facing your own winters. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The valley sat somewhere between the Appalachian foothills and the kind of place that doesn't appear on maps unless you're already lost. It was the kind of settlement that grew not by plan, but by necessity, a scattering of homesteads carved out of timberland in the mid-1800s, where families arrived with wagons, seed bags, and enough stubbornness to mistake hardship for opportunity. His name, according to oral accounts passed down through the county, was Elias Cord, a widower. A man who had come west with a wife and left with only a son, a boy of about 6 years old named Caleb, who had his mother's eyes and his father's habit of watching things too long and too quietly. Elias was not a foolish man. He had worked timber, laid stone, and spent 2 winters in a crew that built mill foundations along a frozen creek before striking out on his own. He understood weight, drainage, and the way cold moves through different materials at different speeds. What he lacked, by the standards of the valley, was the decency to build the way everyone else built. When the other settlers arrived at their parcels, they looked for flat ground, cleared fields near the creek, close to the wagon trail, where lumber could be hauled in and fences run straight. Elias looked up. He looked at the south-facing hillside at the edge of his claim, where a shallow natural depression had been carved by water and time into the slope. He looked at it for 3 days before he drove his first stake. His nearest neighbor, a man named Drury Weston, watched him from across the fence line and reportedly said very little at first. But when Elias began hauling stone to the depression rather than timber to the flat, when it became clear he intended to build into the hill rather than on top of the ground, Weston stopped holding his tongue. "You're going to put your boy in a cave," he said. Elias didn't answer immediately. He was fitting a flat limestone slab into a retaining wall. He pressed it, checked the level by eye, pressed it again. "It's not a cave," he said finally. "It's a hillside with a roof on it." That distinction meant nothing to the community. By the time Elias had finished the first course of his back wall, which was, in fact, the living rock of the hillside itself, the mockery had spread. Men at the mill mentioned it. Women at the trading post shook their heads. There was a particular kind of frontier social pressure that came not from cruelty, but from collective fear. If one family did something strange and it failed, it reflected on the entire settlement's judgment. No one wanted to be associated with failure. And a man digging his home into a hill, with a 6-year-old boy watching from a camp stool nearby, looked very much like the beginning of a failure. What none of them understood, what Elias had not yet found the words to explain, even if he'd wanted to, was that the hillside itself was already doing something that had been happening for thousands of years before any of them arrived, something that no amount of milled lumber or cedar shingles could replicate. The ground was holding heat, not the fire's heat, not warmth from any stove or hearthstone. The Earth, at a depth of just 4 to 6 feet below the frost line, maintains a temperature that barely shifts regardless of what happens above it. In that region, that temperature hovered between 50 degrees Fahrenheit and 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, steady as a clock, indifferent to blizzard or drought. Elias had felt it in the mine tunnels he'd worked as a younger man. He'd felt it digging well shafts. He had never read about thermal mass or geothermal equilibrium in a book because those words didn't yet belong to men who worked with their hands. But he had felt it, and he had remembered. That memory, silent, physical, stored in his palms and his lungs, was the foundation of everything he was about to build. There's an old principle in vernacular building, one that predates any formal school of architecture, that says the best wall is one you did not have to build. Civilizations across the world discovered it independently. The cave dwellers of Cappadocia in what is now Turkey, the cliff house builders of the American Southwest, the sod house settlers of the Great Plains. Each of them, separated by centuries and continents, arrived at the same conclusion. The Earth is not an obstacle to shelter. The Earth is shelter. Elias Cord understood this not through academic study, but through the kind of accumulated observation that frontier life produces in men who pay attention. He had noticed, in his years of outdoor work, that certain hollows stayed warmer in winter and cooler in summer than the open ground around them. He had noticed that a root cellar, even without any fire, never froze solid. He had noticed that the horses in a well-banked barn breathed clouds of visible steam into cold air, while the walls around them stayed above freezing. Not because of the animals' heat alone, but because of the earth pressing in from below. What Elias was working with, without the technical vocabulary to name it, was thermal mass combined with earth sheltering. These two principles, operating together, are among the most powerful passive heating strategies ever identified. Thermal mass refers to the capacity of a dense material, stone, brick, packed earth, clay, to absorb heat slowly and release it slowly. A thick stone wall does not heat up as fast as a thin wooden one, but it also does not cool down as fast. During the hours when the fire burns, the stone is drinking in heat. During the long cold hours after the fire dies down, that same stone is releasing it, steadily, evenly for 6 to 12 hours depending on the mass involved. Earth sheltering adds a second layer to this equation. When three walls and the ceiling of a structure are in direct contact with the hillside, the surrounding ground acts as an enormous insulating buffer. The temperature of that ground, 50 degrees Fahrenheit to 55 degrees Fahrenheit in Elias's valley, means that no matter how cold the air outside drops, the walls themselves never fall below that baseline. A standard frame cabin in the same region, exposed on all four sides to a night at 10 degrees Fahrenheit, could drop to near freezing inside within hours of a fire burning out. Elias's hillside dwelling, even without a single log burning, would never drop below the Earth's ambient temperature. That gap, the difference between 10 degrees Fahrenheit outside and 52 degrees Fahrenheit at the worst case inside, without any fire at all, is not a small engineering detail. It is a survival margin. But Elias did not stop at simply digging into the hill. He chose his specific site with a precision that his neighbors mistook for stubbornness. The depression he selected faced south-southeast, an orientation that would give him low winter sun angle directly into the entrance for several hours each afternoon. This was not decorative. In winter, solar radiation entering through the opening would strike the stone floor and rear wall, adding passive heat gained during the only hours when sunlight was available. In summer, the high sun angle would miss the interior almost entirely, naturally limiting overheating. He also chose the depression for its drainage. Water running downhill during snow melt would pass around both sides of his structure rather than through it. Standing water against a below-grade wall is the death of any earth-sheltered building, not from flooding alone, but from the freeze-thaw expansion that cracks stone and mortar and lets cold infiltrate the thermal mass it took years to build. Elias had seen it happen to root cellars, to spring houses, to the stone foundations of barns. He chose ground that wouldn't hold water, and he graded the entry approach so that any melt would drain forward and away. None of these were accidents. None of them were luck. They were the decisions of a man who had spent years watching what the land did on its own, and had simply chosen to cooperate with it rather than fight it. The valley, watching him move stone and great earth through the last weeks of autumn, saw none of this logic. They saw a grieving widower making strange choices in a desperate season. They saw a child playing near a hole in a hill. They did not see an engineer. By the time the first hard frost arrived, somewhere in late October, according to the seasonal patterns that local oral history describes for that region, Elias had completed the shell of his structure. It was not large, perhaps 14 feet deep into the hillside, 11 feet wide, with a ceiling height of just over 7 feet at the center ridge. Small enough to heat with modest fuel. Large enough for 2 people, a work table, 2 sleeping platforms, and a corner stove that Elias had hauled in sections from the nearest ironworks, 30 miles distant, strapped to the back of a mule. The walls were the defining feature. 3 of them, left, right, and rear, were not built in the traditional sense. They were carved, shaped, and faced. Elias had chiseled and pried away loose shale and soft limestone from the natural face of the hillside until he reached solid, competent rock. Against that rock, he laid a dry-stacked inner face of flat fieldstone, dense sandstone and limestone pieces selected for flatness and weight, fitted together without mortar, each stone chosen to maximize contact with its neighbors and with the living rock behind it. This inner face was, in most sections, between 14 and 18 inches thick. No mortar meant no cracking from freeze-thaw. It also meant the wall could breathe slightly, a property that prevented the moisture buildup that had rotted the interiors of more than a few tightly sealed cabins in the valley. Elias understood, from experience, if not from theory, that a sealed room and a breathable room behave very differently over a winter. One accumulates condensation on its coldest surfaces. The other manages it. The front wall, the only side exposed to open air, was the only section he built conventionally, using a combination of heavy timber framing and double-stacked stone with clay packing between courses. This wall was intentionally thick, nearly 20 inches from outer face to inner face. The entry door was solid split log, hung on iron pinnals, with a draft threshold that swept the floor to prevent cold air from pooling at ground level. Cold air is heavier than warm air. It sinks and slides along floors. Elias had seen it happen in every cabin he'd ever worked in, a fire burning bright at chest height while feet on the floor stayed numbingly cold. The threshold was a simple fix for a problem most builders ignored. The ceiling was his most unconventional choice. Rather than a flat-boarded ceiling with open attic space above, Elias used a barrel vault technique he had observed, by his own account, passed down through a neighbor who had worked with German immigrant masons in Pennsylvania, in which curved wooden ribs support a packed layer of clay and stone above. That packed layer, roughly 10 to 12 inches deep at the crown, added additional thermal mass directly overhead. Heat rises. In a standard cabin, that heat hits a thin wooden ceiling, conducts through it rapidly, and is lost into the cold attic above. In Elias's structure, the heat rose and was absorbed by several hundred pounds of clay and stone. It stayed there, radiating back down through the night. The floor was tamped earth covered with a layer of flat sandstone flags, selected for thickness, not appearance. Stone floors are often maligned in historical accounts as cold and miserable, and they can be, if laid directly on disturbed or wet soil. Elias laid his on a 6-inch bed of dry gravel, which drained any ground moisture downward and away from the stone surface. The flags themselves, once warmed by the stove during the day, held that warmth well into the evening hours. The total weight of stone incorporated into the structure, walls, ceiling pack, and floor, likely exceeded 4,000 pounds, based on the dimensions described. That number is not incidental. It is the mechanism. For 1,000 pounds of dense stone does not heat quickly, and it does not cool quickly. It is effectively a battery. Charge it with 8 hours of fire, and it will discharge that heat for the next 12 to 16 hours with almost no intervention required. Caleb, 6 years old and unimpressed by physics, mostly noticed that the floor was warm to sit on. He spent the evenings close to it, playing with carved wooden figures while his father read by the light of a tallow candle. The neighbors did not visit during the construction. They had already decided what they thought. Winter, however, was coming to offer its own assessment. Of everything Elias Cord built, the stove placement was what baffled people most. The few who eventually came inside and looked. The corner stove, a small, dense cast-iron unit no larger than a steamer trunk, sat not at the center of the room, not near the front wall where drafts could help feed the fire, but in the rear left corner of the structure, pressed as close to the hillside rock face as the flue pipe allowed. This was, by the conventional frontier wisdom of the time, exactly wrong. Stoves were supposed to go near the center of a room, or at most against an interior wall, so that radiant heat could reach all four quadrants of the space equally. Pressing a stove into a back corner seemed to guarantee that most of its warmth would be wasted on two walls instead of radiating into the living space. Drury Weston, who eventually accepted an invitation inside sometime in December of that first year, reportedly stood and looked at the stove for a long moment. "You've got in the corner," he said. "I do," Elias replied. "Heat won't reach the front of the room from there." Elias handed him a cup of something hot and didn't argue. The front of the room was, in fact, the warmest part of the structure, not because of direct stove radiation, but because of what the stove was doing to the stone walls on either side of it. Here is the physics, explained simply. A cast-iron stove radiates heat in all directions simultaneously. In the open center of a room, most of that heat radiates into air, which is a poor thermal storage medium. Air heats quickly and cools quickly. The moment the fire dies, the air temperature begins dropping almost immediately. When that same stove is placed tightly into a corner, with two heavy stone walls flanking it, those walls begin absorbing radiant heat from the very first hour of burning. The stone, the same sandstone and packed limestone that formed those rear and side walls, acts as a thermal accumulator. It does not warm the room as quickly as open radiant heat into air, but it stores that energy in a way that air cannot. The flue pipe also played a deliberate role. Rather than running the pipe straight up through the ceiling in the shortest possible path, Elias ran it horizontally along the back wall for roughly 4 feet before angling it upward through the vault. Every foot of horizontal flue is a foot of pipe radiating heat that would otherwise escape directly up the chimney. Horizontal flue runs are not always ideal in every construction. Improper slope can cause draft problems, but Elias calibrated the run carefully, maintaining a slight upward angle throughout to preserve adequate draw. The result was a flue that functioned as a secondary radiator, warming the rear wall's upper section with exhaust heat that a vertical pipe would have simply expelled into the cold air above. The combined effect of corner placement, thick wall absorption, and extended flue radiation meant that by the time Elias banked the fire for the night, typically between 9 and 10 o'clock in the evening, the rear wall surface temperature was noticeably warm to the touch. Not hot, not uncomfortably so, but warm the way a hearthstone stays warm hours after the last log is burned down. Steadily, gently, and with a patience that no fire in open air can match. Oral accounts from the valley, preserved in a brief written memoir by Caleb's grandson, discovered in a county archive in the early 20th century, describe Elias's nightly routine with a precision that suggests Caleb either witnessed it himself or heard it described many times. Elias would bank the fire, move a flat hearthstone that had been warming near the stove base into the center of the sleeping area, cover it loosely with a folded canvas, and set Caleb's sleeping platform close enough to benefit from the radiated warmth through the night. The hearthstone was not the primary heat source. It was insurance. The walls were the primary heat source, silent, slow, and reliable in a way that no wood fire can be. On a night when outside temperatures dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit, the interior of the hillside dwelling reportedly held between 48 degrees Fahrenheit and 54 degrees Fahrenheit by early morning, without any fire burning after midnight. A conventional frame cabin of similar floor area, with a standard centerplace stove, would have required at least 2 additional fuel loads through the night to maintain comparable conditions, and would still likely have seen interior temperatures fall to the mid-30s degree F by dawn if those loads were missed. The difference was not dramatic. It was not magic. It was geometry, mass, and the quiet cooperation of a man with the hillside that had been there long before him. The storm, when it finally came, would make that difference impossible to ignore. Nobody in the valley had seen 9 feet of snow fall in a single event. Not in living memory. Not in any account that the older settlers had passed down from the generation before them. Local oral history places the storm sometime in the late 1850s, during a winter that several families later described, in letters and journals that survived to county archive collections, as the worst stretch of cold they had ever endured or expected to endure. It began, as the worst storms often do, with deceptive gentleness. A low sky, a stillness in the air that the animals felt before the people did. By nightfall on the first day, snow was falling steadily, not violently, not in driving sheets, but in the heavy, wet, relentless curtain that accumulates faster than it looks like it should. By morning, the valley floor carried 18 inches. By the second evening, that number had nearly doubled. On the third day, the wind arrived. It came from the northwest, channeled by the ridgeline above the valley into something faster and more focused than it had any right to be. It drove the snow horizontally against every north-facing and west-facing wall in the settlement. It found every gap in every chinking, every loose board, every poorly fitted shutter. A frame cabin that had been drafty in October, tolerable then, merely uncomfortable, became something else entirely when wind-driven snow could be felt as a current of cold air moving across the floor at shin height. Drury Weston's cabin, a well-built structure of notched logs with a center hearthstone fireplace, burned through nearly a full cord of wood in those 3 days. He and his wife took turns feeding the fire through the night, each sleeping in 2-hour intervals while the other kept watch over the flames. The fireplace, drawing hard against the wind pressure outside, consumed wood at nearly twice its normal rate. On the second night, the interior temperature dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit before dawn despite continuous burning, because the fire's output was being overwhelmed by infiltration. Cold air forcing its way in through gaps faster than the fire could replace the warmth it lost. 2 families on the valley's north end did not wait for the third day. They loaded what they could onto a single sled and walked to the nearest neighbor with a barn large enough to shelter both people and animals. The decision was reasonable. The alternative, staying in a building that was losing its battle with the cold, was not something they were willing to test. Elias cord structure was not tested in the same way. It could not be, by virtue of its geometry. The hillside itself blocked the northwest wind entirely. The rear 3/4 of the structure sat inside the earth, insulated on all sides and above by thousands of pounds of ground that had not changed temperature in months. The front wall, the only surface exposed to the open air, faced south-southeast, away from the prevailing wind direction. The door, thick and draft-sealed, received no direct wind pressure at all. The storm, from the perspective of Elias's structure, was happening on the other side of a hill. He had banked the fire at 10 o'clock on the first night of the storm, as was his habit. He did not relight it until mid-morning of the second day, not because the temperature required it urgently, but because Caleb wanted hot porridge and the morning was gray enough to warrant the comfort of visible flame. Oral accounts from Caleb's later life describe his father moving calmly through those 3 days, unhurried in a way that struck the boy as so natural he didn't understand its significance until years later. "I thought all homes were like that," Caleb reportedly said in later life. "I didn't know until I slept in a proper cabin that winter could come inside." The temperature inside the hillside dwelling on the coldest recorded morning of that storm, when outside readings at the valley's single mercury thermometer reportedly reached 4 degrees Fahrenheit, held, by Caleb's later account and cross-referenced with the oral memoir recorded by his grandson, at somewhere between 46 degrees Fahrenheit and 51 degrees Fahrenheit, without any fire burning since the previous evening. At that same hour, Weston's fireplace was consuming its 4th consecutive log of the night, and the temperature inside his cabin had dropped to the low 30s degree F near the floor. Same valley, same storm, same wood species burning in both structures. Completely different result. When the storm broke and the snow settled into the deep, hard stillness that follows a major event. The valley took stock of itself. The accounting was practical and immediate. How much would have been burned? How cold had it gotten? Would have been damaged? What would need to be rebuilt before the next storm arrived? These were not abstract questions. On the frontier, the arithmetic of winter survival was as concrete as the weight of a log or the depth of a frost line. A family that burned through its wood supply in February was in genuine danger. Resupply in deep snow was not always possible, and a nearest settlement with surplus timber could be a full day's travel on a good road, which did not exist in 9 feet of drifted snow. Drury Weston burned through nearly a full cord and a half of split hardwood during those 3 days and 2 nights. A cord of firewood, for reference, is a stack measuring 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, a substantial volume. At the burn rates his fireplace demanded during the storm, he estimated, and this figure appears in a letter he wrote to a relative the following spring, preserving county historical records, that he had used roughly 18 months' worth of his projected winter fuel supply in 3 days. He was not alone. Several families in the valley reported similar ratios of emergency fuel consumption, and at least one household had burned fence posts and a section of outbuilding siding before the storm ended. Elias' cord burned, by contrast, approximately 1/3 of a cord during the same period. This was not because he was rationing dangerously. It was because the structure did not demand more. The fire he lit each morning was a comfort fire, not a survival fire. It warmed the room from its overnight baseline of 46 degrees Fahrenheit to 52 degrees Fahrenheit to a more comfortable 62 degrees Fahrenheit to 67 degrees Fahrenheit within 2 to 3 hours of lighting. It then held that temperature with modest fuel additions through the afternoon. By evening, when he banked it again, the stone walls had absorbed another full day's worth of heat and were prepared to release it slowly through the night. The thermal arithmetic, worked out in rough terms, is illuminating. The mass of stone in Elias's structure, estimated at between 3,800 and 4,200 pounds based on the described dimensions, had a heat capacity roughly 4 to 5 times greater than an equivalent volume of still air. When that mass was brought from a baseline of 52 degrees Fahrenheit to a surface temperature of 72 degrees Fahrenheit over the course of 8 to 10 hours of stove operation, it stored the equivalent of several hours of continuous fire output. As the interior air cooled after the fire was banked, the stone released that stored energy into the room, not as a burst, but as a slow, even hours-long radiation that a thermometer would show as a gradual, almost imperceptible decline rather than the sharp overnight drop typical of a wood-framed, minimally massed interior. In practical terms, Elias's structure lost roughly 8 degrees Fahrenheit to 12 degrees Fahrenheit of interior temperature overnight, depending on outside conditions. Weston's cabin, with no significant thermal mass and a fireplace that exhausted most of its heat up a vertical chimney, lost between 25 degrees Fahrenheit and 35 degrees Fahrenheit overnight under the same conditions, and that was with periodic midnight fuel additions. Without them, the drop was steeper. The fuel ratio across the storm, 1/3 of a cord versus 1.5 cords, translates to a consumption difference of roughly 78% less wood for the hillside structure. That figure is not a laboratory measurement. It is a field comparison between 2 neighboring families in the same weather event, with similar family sizes, both trying to maintain livable interior conditions. The difference, in a season where fuel supply was finite and resupply was not guaranteed, was the difference between margin and crisis. Word of this spread through the valley with the particular speed that practical, verifiable information always travels in small communities. People did not need a scientific paper to understand what the numbers meant. They had all just lived through the same storm. They knew what they had burned. And when they heard what Elias had burned, or rather, had not burned, the conversation changed. It did not change instantly. Pride is slow to move. But the questions began, and questions, once started, tend to go somewhere. The first person to come asking was not Weston. It was a younger man, a homesteader named Rufus Alcott, who had arrived in the valley only the previous spring and had not yet accumulated the social investment in being right that the older settlers carried. He came one afternoon about a week after the storm, with his hat in his hands and a directness that Elias apparently respected. "I want to understand what you did," Rufus said. "Not to argue with it, to understand it." Elias invited him inside. What followed, according to Caleb's later account and the oral tradition that preserved fragments of it, was not a lecture. Elias was not a man who explained things in paragraphs. He was a man who showed them. He walked Rufus to the rear wall and pressed his palm flat against the stone. He waited until Rufus did the same and registered the warmth there, faint, steady, unmistakable in a room where no fire had burned since early morning. "Stone doesn't forget," Elias reportedly said. "You put heat in, it keeps it." He showed Rufus the stove placement, the corner position, the flanking walls, the horizontal run of the flue pipe along the back wall before it angled upward. He explained, in the plain language of a man who had worked construction and timber, why the corner was better than the center, not for radiating heat into air, but for feeding heat into stone. He showed Rufus the draft threshold at the door, the packed clay and stone ceiling vault, the gravel drainage bed beneath the sandstone floor flags. He showed Rufus the orientation, south-southeast, and explained, with a gesture toward the low winter sun visible through the open door, why the afternoon light entered the room at exactly the angle that touched the rear stone wall directly. Passive solar gain, though Elias would not have used those words. The sun, in the short winter afternoon hours, was a free second stove. It warmed the stone that would hold its warmth through the night. Rufus asked questions. Elias answered them. Caleb, then about 7 years old, listened from his sleeping platform with the particular attention of a child who understands that something important is being said, even if he cannot yet say why. Over the following weeks, others came. Weston arrived, last among the immediate neighbors, as might be expected. He was a proud man and a fair one, and when he finally crossed the threshold and placed his hand on the rear wall and felt the warmth there 3 hours after the fire had been banked, he stood quietly for a moment before he spoke. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't," Elias replied. "Then I owe you a question. Can a man build this into an existing cabin? Bank earth against the walls, add mass to the interior?" The answer was yes, partially. Earth sheltering could be retrofitted to existing structures by banking soil against exterior walls on the north and west sides, reducing wind infiltration and adding a buffer of ground temperature insulation. Interior thermal mass could be increased by building thick stone or brick interior walls, or by replacing thin flooring with flagstone on a gravel base. The stove could be repositioned into a corner flanked by the heaviest existing walls. None of these changes would replicate a fully earth-sheltered structure built from the ground up, but each one would move the needle, reduce overnight temperature drop, lower fuel consumption, extend the useful warmth of a single fire. Rufus Alcott began planning modifications to his own cabin before spring thaw. 2 other families followed over the next 2 winters. The changes they made were partial, improvised, and varied, but every household that implemented even a subset of Elias's principles reported noticeable reductions in fuel consumption and more stable overnight temperatures. The mockery had not just been proven wrong. It had been replaced by something rarer in frontier communities, genuine curiosity, offered without ego, in the direction of a man who had been right all along. Walk through any new construction neighborhood in the northern United States today, and you will see the same thing repeated with minor variations. A wood or steel frame, wrapped in a layer of synthetic insulation, typically fiberglass bats or rigid foam board, sheathed in oriented strand board or plywood, then covered with vinyl siding or thin brick veneer. The walls are fast to build, relatively inexpensive per square foot, and achieve respectable R values on paper. What they do not have is thermal mass. The distinction matters more than most people realize. R value measures resistance to heat flow, essentially, how slowly a material allows heat to pass through it. A thick fiberglass bat has a high R value. So does a layer of spray foam. These materials slow the movement of heat from inside to outside, which is genuinely useful. But they do not store heat. The moment the furnace or heat pump stops running, there is no reservoir of warmth in the walls themselves, no slow-releasing mass that continues to condition the interior air. The temperature inside a modern, well-insulated frame house begins declining immediately when the heating system shuts off. In a structure with significant thermal mass, the thick stone and brick walls of Elias's era, the rammed earth and adobe of the Southwest, the stacked limestone of old Scandinavian farmhouses, the heating system can cycle off for hours while the walls continue releasing stored heat into the room. The interior temperature curve is not a cliff. It is a slope, a gentle, hours-long slope that allows occupants to sleep comfortably through a cold night without the furnace running continuously. Modern construction addressed this problem by making heating systems more powerful, more efficient, and more automated. The thermostat replaced the thermal mass. The forced air furnace replaced the hearthstone. And in a world of cheap, abundant fuel, that trade-off was largely invisible. An automated gas furnace, cycling on and off 40 times a night, does not inconvenience anyone. The cost is simply absorbed into the utility bill. But the cost is real. The average American household spends between $800 and $1,500 per year on space heating, depending on region, home size, and fuel type. Figures from energy consumption surveys that have tracked residential fuel use for decades. A home with equivalent or superior thermal performance through passive mass and earth sheltering could, under the right design conditions, reduce that figure by 40 to 70% without any compromise in comfort. The technology to do it is not new. It is not experimental. It is, in fact, older than the Republic. The irony is not subtle. Elias Cord, digging his home into a hillside in the 1850s while his neighbors shook their heads, was practicing a form of passive building science that contemporary architects and energy researchers have spent decades trying to reintroduce into mainstream construction under names like thermal mass design, earth-sheltered housing, and passive annual heat storage. The principles behind those terms: dense materials that absorb and release heat slowly, ground contact that provides a stable thermal baseline, orientation that captures winter solar gain while limiting summer overheating, are identical to what Elias was doing by intuition and experience more than 170 years ago. The difference is that Elias was doing it without a subsidy, without an energy audit, without a building permit or an architect's stamp. He was doing it because he was cold, because he had a child to keep warm, and because he had paid close enough attention to the world around him to understand what the ground already knew. The efficiency was not a design feature. It was a consequence of understanding. Caleb Cord grew up in the hillside. He grew up knowing, in the way that children know things absorbed before language gives them names, that a home could be warm without being loud about it, that a fire did not need to roar to do its work, that stone remembered, and that the earth beneath your feet was not a surface to be covered, but a partner to be cooperated with. He was not a builder by trade. Oral accounts suggest he worked timber and later ran a small sawmill operation in an adjacent county. But he carried the principles his father had practiced in the only way knowledge survives before it is written down, by applying them whenever the opportunity arose. He banked earth against the north wall of his own home. He laid flagstone over gravel in his cellar and used it for year-round food storage. When he built a smokehouse, he built it partially into the hillside behind his property, not out of sentiment, but because he remembered, from boyhood, what the hillside did. His son, Elias's grandson, went further. According to a brief local newspaper account from the early 20th century, discovered in a county archive, the younger man built a root cellar and storage annex for a small farming cooperative in the region using techniques he described as the old way. Earth contact, stone mass, southern orientation, flagstone flooring on drainage gravel. The cooperative used the structure for cold storage of produce and, in winter, as a meeting space that required no additional heating beyond the body heat of its occupants and one small stove. It served the community for more than 40 years before it was eventually superseded by mechanical refrigeration. 3 generations. One decision made on a hillside by a grieving widower with a 6-year-old boy and no one's approval. The valley that had mocked Elias Cord eventually forgot that it had done so. That is also the way of things. The loudest skeptics rarely acknowledge the moment when they stop being skeptical. They simply begin speaking about the idea differently, as though they had always understood it. Weston built earth berms against his cabin's north and west walls the following autumn. He told his neighbor it was a windbreak. It was a windbreak. It was also, whether he said so or not, thermal mass. The lesson of Elias Cord's hillside is not that earth shelter construction is the only right way to build, or that modern construction is without value. The lesson is simpler and harder to dismiss. It is the lesson that the frontier, in its unforgiving way, always taught eventually, that understanding the environment you are building in matters more than following the convention you brought with you. That the materials around you, properly read and properly used, will do work that no amount of additional fuel can replicate. That physics does not change based on what the neighbors think. 9 feet of snow has a way of making that lesson very clear. The fire that Elias banked the night the storm arrived was still warming his son in the morning. It was still warming the stone. And in the way that ideas move through families and communities and generations, it is still warming the people who hear this story and think, maybe I should look at my hillside differently. Maybe the ground already knows something.